Welcome to Trump's Trade War, the Hub's daily YouTube show looking at President Trump's trade moves and the reaction of Canadian governments. I'm Harrison Lohman, managing editor of the Hub, and I'm so pleased to be joined today by Alicia Planenchich, Director of Policy and Economics at the Business Council of Alberta. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Okay, let's jump into this because you had a piece for us today looking at inflation. At the start of your piece, you quote the fiery White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt saying tariffs are a tax cut for the American people. Are they a tax cut? What do you make of her remarks?
Yeah, so I mean, as economists will tell you, they're obviously not a tax cut. They are actually an additional tax on consumer goods. But what we were interested in with this Econ Minute was looking kind of not from the perspective of Americans or the US, but actually from the perspective of Canadians. And specifically, the kind of interesting information that we have is we have surveys asking different Canadians, what do you expect to see in terms of inflation? And what's particularly interesting here is this is our first look at the data since this talk of tariffs started, essentially.
I like how you call it talk. Talk, screaming, etc.
Exactly. So I have to be very particular with when this data was collected. So it was collected in February. So here in March, which February feels like years ago, we have to remember back in February, it really was mostly talk. It was kind of still this cat and mouse game, tariff announcements were being made and then pushed out, but nothing was really actually in play. But there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of headlines. And so this is kind of our look at, what do businesses and consumers and economists make of inflation given the tariff talk at that time.
Okay, so let's look at the reaction to that talk. I'm just going to put up a graph up on our screen now. So we're looking at the question, these folks being, how will Trump's tariffs and our retaliatory tariffs, to keep that in mind as well, affect prices at home? And there's some differences here, right, between businesses, consumers, and economists. Can you take us through what those differences look like with the graph on the screen?
Yeah, exactly. So what the chart is showing is basically just if we were to ask Canadians, what do you expect inflation to be about a year from now? This is basically that answer. And so the latest data, as I was mentioning, the last time that we've asked Canadians was in February. Normally, we wouldn't even be releasing that data, but Bank of Canada has been so kind to release sort of preliminary estimates to give the eager economists a quick look. And what you'll notice is, what really stands out is consumers. So Canadian consumers are the most worried about inflation. We see that very clear uptick in February, where we're otherwise seeing inflation expectations go back down. So consumers are clearly worried about inflation. They're paying attention to the headlines. And they're taking it to mean a reality, not just talk, right? Now, businesses, on the other hand, it's a little bit different. So I would say businesses are still pretty worried. We're seeing that uptick. And I think what's particularly important to mention around businesses is that they know a thing or two of what's happening, right? And they reported that they are seeing their inputs, they're seeing their costs increase. Right, so they know that their costs are increasing, and they're also saying that they expect to pass along at least some of that cost increase onto the consumer, right? So they're expecting inflation to go up as well, maybe not quite as much as consumers, but they're still very worried just coming out of this tariff talk and just some of the things that they're seeing early on, even as of February, even though there was really not much in play. But certainly their business decisions had already been affected by this uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned it's affecting contracts specifically, right? Can you explain in terms of business contracts how the uncertainty is affecting that?
Yeah, exactly. So they're basically, because of the uncertainty, the expectation is that, probably we'll see some prices rise. And so to protect suppliers' interests, I think there is a negotiation happening. So for contracts that are for, months or years long, those are being renegotiated at higher prices, sort of expecting that we'll see at least something come into play. Will we see 25% across the board? What will we see as far as retaliation? Who knows? But they're trying to hedge their bets there a little bit.
We're also hearing about stockpiling as tariffs potentially roll down the pike. Let's go back to the graph just one more time. Economists, they are thinking what in terms of the worry scale? Where do they fall?
Yeah, I mean, you look at this chart and you almost laugh a little bit, right? It's like what world are economists living in? Or maybe the press secretary was right. Maybe tariffs don't flow through to prices and we shouldn't be worried. And so, yeah, the question is, why have economist expectations, at least as of February, they don't seem to be anticipating that inflation will rise. Why is that? Honestly, I think one of the reasons is simply that they were taking it all to be talk. If we kind of remember what we were thinking just a few weeks ago, there was still kind of this idea that it was the negotiating tactic, which I think at this point seems a little bit less clear, right? And so I think that was probably playing into their forecast. But there's another factor too, and that factor is a less happy factor, which is that the impact of these tariffs and more protectionism is going to have another effect as well, which is that it's going to weaken the Canadian economy. And we're already seeing this, consumers are already reporting, I'm not making a big purchase, I'm not looking to go out and buy a car or a new sofa this month, especially those that are worried. So if we look at folks that are working in those industries like oil and gas or mining, they in particular are really worried about job security. And so they're not spending as much. And then this, we can only imagine that this would grow. And so the reality is that will actually put, as Tiff Macklem says, downward pressure on prices. So certain, if you imagine an individual household, certain things, cosmetics are going to go up in price as retaliation hits those prices hard. But other things, imagine individual restaurants, right? If people are worried about their jobs, they're tightening their belts, they're not going out to eat, then those prices aren't going to go up as much. And so I think what Tiff Macklem and what some economists are saying is maybe we won't see that headline inflation go up as much, but it's partly just because we have, unfortunately, a weak economy.
Alicia, do we know how many job losses have already taken place as a result of tariffs or threat of tariffs? Like, has that been, have those numbers been put together yet? Do we have a sense of how big that is?
Yeah, it's a little bit too early, right? So we just are a little bit too early of being able to see that impact. The other thing is too, we have to remember that jobs are probably going to be secondary in terms of businesses and the changes that they can make. They're going to cut back on other areas where they can, especially, it's also going to depend on, do businesses believe that this is short term or long term, right? If it's short term, maybe I can weather through. If it's long term, then I have to make cuts right away. And it's also going to depend on the industry. If my profit margins, like in manufacturing, are really small, then I might have to make cuts right away. But as you mentioned, there's also some stockpiling that's happening. So this is kind of messing up our economic data a little bit in ways that make certain things kind of look good or make it look like there's more activity than there will be.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem. I was speaking to our editor at large for business and economics, Theo Argytis, the other day, and he was telling me this announcement that he made on Thursday, which he described as, the bank is going to more formally integrate economic uncertainty into its monetary policy framework, moving the focus away from pinpoint forecasts, instead spending more time thinking about how what might produce poor outcomes in the future. Can you give us a sense about, how the Bank of Canada is thinking about this? Obviously, they're thinking maybe it's more long-term than short-term, as you just said.
Yeah, I mean, I think for regular people, my key takeaway from what he's saying is that they're really thinking about making those decisions not based just on data, but based on human judgment. I think is really going to play an important role, and this is always true of really any central bank, but certainly the Bank of Canada. That they're driven by data, they're informed by data. But they're, especially in this case where this is a situation that's totally new and different from anything that we've seen before, they're not just kind of plugging data into ChatGPT and it telling us whether to raise or lower rates. I think they're really going to have to think a little bit more, use a bit more analysis. For instance, some indicators are going to go up and are going to look good, as we said with the stockpiling. And so there are certain things with our data that I think they're going to have to try to see more clearly through the data and make some expectations on, what is going to be the next move out of the Trump administration, which, I mean, good luck, right? But certainly that uncertainty is all going to play into how they're making their decisions.
Just lastly, what do you think, short term or long term? What's your gut say? that
with
this
these tariffs.
uncertainty will last.
So I've said all along, I think the best thing that we and most people in the world have going for us is the fact that it is going to hurt the U.S. and it's going to hurt the U.S. in a way that's eventually going to hurt Trump and politics. And so I think, at the end of the day, economics prices are going to go up. The U.S. economy is going to slow and weaken, and we've clearly seen that in the forecast. We clearly saw that from the Federal Reserve. And so I think that, it's just a matter of how long can they sort of withstand before there's ultimately an uproar, right? And I think we're already seeing bits of that, but it's just a matter of how much longer. I don't see them being able to play the long game here.
Waiting for that sort of trickle down into the general population. Okay, that's Alicia Planicic. She is Director of Policy and Economics at the Business Council of Alberta. Thank you so much for joining us again. Real pleasure.
Always a pleasure. Take care.
All the best.